story famously goes, Tolkien was in process of grading exams, and a student who apparently was failing miserably had just left an entire page blank. And he almost could have given this kid points for leaving the page blank because he's so tired of grading exams at this point. And on the blank page, he writes, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." And he has no idea why he has written this sentence. He doesn't know what's hobbit. What is that word? What is this? He doesn't know. He has no idea. And in the process of writing out the sentence, it really bothers him, and so he starts kind of pulling at the threads. And a lot of artists talk about this, that sculptors or authors or whoever, that when they're working on something, they're not really writing it, they're discovering it. Does that make sense? Right? That as they work on it, they discover more and more about that thing. And so he's discovering more and more about the word hobbit and what it is, and where did he come up with that? Especially because he's obsessed with philology. He wants to know, where does this word come from? What is the origin of this word? And he has also got a very curious young son by the name of Christopher Tolkien, who's very, very interested in his stories. And he's told stories to them before. He's told them, if you've ever read the Father Christmas letters, they're excellent. Rover Random, there's all these great kids stories that he would tell for his kids. So he decides to start developing this sort of into a children's story. And eventually these guys, Allen and Unwin, the publishers, this is all Tolkien's painting, by the way, which this is all on exhibit in New York right now, so if you just want to hop on a plane and go to New York real quick. But it's all on exhibit right now, his paintings. He's a fantastic artist, as you can see. Allen and Unwin are going to be curious about this. His friend Stanley Unwin, in particular, is wondering what Tolkien's working on. And Tolkien ultimately decides to let Unwin's son, Rainer Unwin, who's 10 years old, read the manuscript of The Hobbit. So yeah, he gave the manuscript of The Hobbit to a 10-year-old boy. I mean, I'd just like to point that out for a second. He gave the manuscript of The Hobbit to a 10-year-old boy. And Rainer really likes it. He really likes the story, and he says, "Dad, I think this is a great story. It's got wizards and dragons and stuff, and there's dwarves. Pretty cool." Right? I'm doing my impression of a 10-year-old English boy from 100 years ago. So ultimately they end up publishing it, and because Tolkien has some connections through Oxford, he's also going to get some really great reviews from people that he's met. There's this guy, I don't know if you've heard of him, named C.S. Lewis. He's going to review The Hobbit, W.H. Auden. There's a bunch of really famous people. Well, they're famous to us now, but people who worked at Oxford or were affiliated with the university scene in England, and they're going to review it very positively. And so, The Hobbit comes out. And it's actually a hit. It's a big hit. Tolkien thinks he's not going to get anything out of this. He thinks nothing's going to come of this. And he's going to get a big royalty check for, I believe it was £5,000, which is a lot of money back then in 1937, for the publication of The Hobbit. And he's so upset because he just renewed his contract at Oxford. And if he had known that this book would be a hit, he wouldn't have renewed his contract. But, alas. And so, naturally, what happens after a book is a smashing success? Where's the next one? Where's the next one, Ronald? Well, not there yet. So, I will call him Ronald, because that's what he went by, Ronald. Ronald says, I'm done with Hobbits, I don't have anything else to say about it.
I was just going to ask you, because I noticed there's a friend called him John Ronald.
John Ronald, yeah.
So was he known as, or just Ronald?
He was known as Ronald, and then at Oxford, a lot of times people called him Tollers, was another nickname for him. Tollers, Tollers, yeah.
Tolkien, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Like Tolkien, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So Ronald was what he went by, though, or John Ronald. So, he says, no, I'm done with Hobbits. I don't have anything else to say about Hobbits. I've got some stuff I wrote in the trench that is going to be the basis of the Silmarillion, if you want to read that. And they don't want to read that because it's a mess. Okay, so because he was kind of working on it in bits and pieces over years and years and years, so he has kind of this totally ridiculous, out of order manuscript that's just, I don't know how Christopher Tolkien put it together. I really don't know how he did it. But they said, no, we want more hobbits. More hobbits. We don't want your epic elf stories. We don't want that. We want more hobbits. I'm done with hobbits. Now, come on, you can find something, right? And of course he's like, okay. And he goes back and he starts working on the process. And so that's what I mentioned way back before I started the presentation on the History of Middle-earth series that talks about the writing process of The Lord of the Rings. And a lot of this is because he's having to go back. So he's finished The Hobbit, and he's like, okay, where am I going to go from here? What am I going to do next? And so he starts working on this idea of like the magic ring, right? Because the ring was kind of important, so he's going to start pulling on that. He's going to create the Black Riders, and everything's just going to spring out. It's only going to take him about 16 years to do it. And in the 16 years that it's going to take, stop having wars, you guys. Quit it, right? Another war is going to break out in aggressions and things are going to start in 36 to 39 or so. So, the sad part about this now is that Tolkien's children are now old enough to be called to war. So now he's kind of going back and sort of having to deal with this all over again, right? He's already lived through the war. He knows his own experiences having lived through the war. And so now he's going to be writing back and forth with Christopher Tolkien in particular, kind of trying to take his mind off of things, I think, in his own Tolkien-ish way. Christopher's going to be deployed to South Africa in the RAF. And this is actually a really important point. Christopher was supposed to be working on and with planes. All right? Tolkien does not care for technology, if you have not noticed that yet in his themes in the books. But that's something we're going to talk about. So Christopher's deployed. And I've got just some images here. So in some of his letters, of course these are images from World War I, Tolkien's going to be kind of talking about his experiences in the war versus what Christopher is now going through in World War II. I'll keep right here. So this is the quote heavy part of the presentation today. I hope you all will indulge me. But Tolkien has some great quotes, in particular from his letters that I would like to share with you all. And they're written to Christopher. Okay. So I'd like to start off with just him talking to Christopher, and this was in 1945, so close to the end of the war, right? Basically the end, right? I had just heard the news. Russians 60 miles from Berlin. It does look as if something decisive might happen soon. The appalling destruction and misery of this war mount hourly. Destruction of what should be, indeed is, the Commonwealth of Europe and the world. If mankind were not so besotted, wealth the loss of which will affect us all, victors or not. Yet people gloat to hear the endless lines, 40 miles long, of miserable refugees, women and children pouring west, dying on the way. There seem no bowels of mercy or compassion, no imagination left in this dark, diabolic hour. By which I do not mean that it may not all, in the present situation, mainly, not solely created by Germany, be necessary and inevitable. But why gloat? We were supposed to have reached a stage of civilization in which it might still be necessary to execute a criminal, but not to gloat, or to hang his wife and child by him while the orc crowd hooted. The destruction of Germany, be it 100 times merited, is one of the most appalling world catastrophes. Well, you and I can do nothing about it. And that should be a measure of the amount of guilt that can justly be assumed to attach to any member of a country who is not a member of its actual government. Well, the first war of the machines seems to be drawing to its final and conclusive chapter, leaving, alas, everyone the poorer, many bereaved or maimed, and millions dead, and only one thing triumphant: the machines. As the servants of the machines are becoming a privileged class, the machines are going to be enormously more powerful. What is their next move? It's an amazing quote. I love that quote. There's so much to unpack from that, right? There's so much to unpack. Talking about, what I would call Schadenfreude, like, being happy at your enemy's destruction and their demise. Talking about the machines, which he really despises. He hates that Christopher is potentially in a plane. He hated cars. He had a car, and he crashed it. He hated machines, right? And so he kind of talks about some of this stuff with Christopher, kind of trying to help help him to sort of feel better about certain things. One of the main things that he likes to do in his letters too is just talk about the general mundane stuff that's going on back home in England. Like he likes to complain that his local pub got closed. Like that's one of his things. He complains about his chickens and having to chase them around and that they're dirty. He's talking about his victory garden, right? Because that was very common to have a victory garden sort of thing going on back then. But occasionally these big nuggets come out where you can really see how he feels about this stuff. And one of the other things you can notice, in addition to in his letters talking about his feelings on war, is his descriptions of battle. And a lot of people, whenever I talk to people about Tolkien, a lot of times they'll tell me, oh, his descriptions are great. Does a great job of describing this stuff. And as I was just telling someone before the lecture started, C.S. Lewis very famously read this passage, and he said, or this particular chapter in the passage of the marshes, and he said the only way that someone could have written this, it had to be somebody who lived through World War I. Nobody else could have experienced this unless they had been in World War I. And so this is from the Two Towers in Book 4, it's chapter 2, passage of the marshes. Dreadful as the dead marshes had been and the arid moors of the no-man lands, more loathsome by far was the country that the crawling day now slowly unveiled to his shrinking eyes. Here nothing lived, not even the leprous growths that feed on rottenness. The gasping pools were choked with ash and crawling muds, sickly white and gray, as if the mountains had vomited the filth of their entrails on the lands about. I mean, what a description. What a description, right? And there's a lot of this with talking about Frodo and Sam in particular, right? Because they're kind of crawling their way through Mordor, and you know, they're absolutely famished and they're filthy. And then, you know, this whole part of the book, of course, talking about like the dead faces in the water. If you recall Gollum talking about how they've lit little candles and that they seem to be cursed and all this stuff. I mean, a lot of that sort of evokes the imagery of World War I when you consider that, you know, bodies were often sucked into the mud. They could reemerge months later in a rain or something like that. But you could, you know, see that kind of thing happening. Also, of course, a very, very obvious, you know, you've got the no-man lands up there, right? No man's land, having to cross the trench and all that. So there's a lot that you can kind of unpack from different descriptions in here. Here's some examples, of course, of the machines, right? We're talking about this war of the machines and how they are now, anybody who sports them is this privileged class from that quote. The tank, of course, was one of the first times we see the tank roll out, was in World War I, and then I've got airplanes and treed over here, which I think is kind of cool. There's some fun stuff where Tolkien is talking about how much he hates Christopher being in a plane, which I think is a lot of fun. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Now, this is all very depressing. I feel like we've taken a dark turn. And Tolkien is working through that, this concept, this dark idea. And how can anything good happen after we have all this terrible stuff, right? Like, this is all destruction from World War I. How can you live through something so terrible and then have such a hope that anything will ever be good again, right? This is kind of a component of the end of the Lord of the Rings, right? Like, how can Frodo, you know, once Frodo has destroyed the ring, well, Frodo didn't destroy the ring, right? Gollum did. Frodo lost his finger in the process. But once the ring is destroyed, Frodo suddenly feels this uplifted feeling, right? That he's kind of getting his memories back, his feeling back, because the ring has possessed him to such a degree for so long that he felt like he was living with this depression, this despair. And so how can you overcome that level of despair? That's the question. How can you overcome that despair? And so I have another passage, and this is what we're going to talk about, is this word that Tolkien is going to coin. And this is Faramir and Éowyn talking in The Steward and the King at the end, close to the end of the Return of the King. So I'll read it out loud to you. And as they stood so, their hands met and clasped, though they did not know it. And still they waited, for they knew not what. Then presently it seemed to them that above the ridges of the distant mountains, another vast mountain of darkness rose, towering up like a wave that should engulf the world. And about it lightnings flickered. And then a tremor ran through the earth, and they felt the walls of the city quiver. A sound like a sigh went up from all the lands about them. and their hearts beat suddenly again. It reminds me of Numenor, said Faramir, and wondered to hear himself speak. Of Numenor, said Eowyn. Yes, said Faramir, of the land of westerness that foundered, and of the great dark wave climbing over the green lands and above the hills and coming on, darkness inescapable. I often dream of it. Then you think that the darkness is coming, said Eowyn? Darkness inescapable? And suddenly she drew close to him. No, said Faramir, looking into her face. It was but a picture in the mind. I do not know what is happening. The reason of my waking mind tells me that great evil has befallen, and we stand at the end of days. But my heart says nay, and all my limbs are light, and a hope and joy are come to me that no reason can deny. Eowyn, White Lady of Rohan, in this hour I do not believe that any darkness will endure. It seems kind of strange, right? Because even at the end of the Return of the King, it seems inevitable that Sauron is going to win, right? He's going to win, but he doesn't. We know that he doesn't. Spoiler alert. We know that he doesn't, right? How is that possible? How can he be defeated? And this is going to tie into a phrase that Tolkien's going to coin called eucatastrophe. He's kind of working on this concept for a long time, and he's been working on the word eucatastrophe and sort of what it means. And I'm going to tell you what it means, because I know you're all probably looking at this thinking catastrophe, right? You can see catastrophe before. So a catastrophe or a discatastrophe is something that is terrible, right? Terrible things that have happened, that would be a catastrophe. A eucatastrophe is a little different. And he talks about this in letter 89 in 1944. He's writing to Christopher Tolkien. And all of a sudden I realized what it was. The very thing that I have been trying to write about and explain in that fairy story essay that I so much wish you had read that I think I shall send it to you. For it, I coined the word eucatastrophe, the sudden happy turn in a story which pierces you with a joy that brings tears, which I argue it is the highest function of fairy stories to produce. So this is sort of like his argument that this is the point, right? This is the point of writing a story, is that you want it to produce joy. You want people to experience joy and happiness when they read. And that's kind of how he's able to do this. And of course, he's got his own eucatastrophe at the end of The Return of the King, right? Like I just said, how can Sauron be defeated? It seems impossible that he could be, right? He has everything going for him. And even it's a great moment in The Return of the King when Sauron suddenly notices that Frodo has put on the ring and he's inside Mount Doom, right? He's getting ready. He's supposed to throw it into the fire, but then he doesn't, right? He puts on the ring instead because he decides he's going to be the master of the ring. And Sauron, it's great. He realizes what's happened and that he has made a fatal error. He has made a fatal miscalculation. He never thought anybody would try to destroy the ring. He thought everyone would be overcome by it, and they weren't, right? And that's not what's going to happen. Big ups to Sam, right? Sam is a big part of that. Sam's a big part of that. But certainly Gollum is too, right? And so Gollum in his own way, it's like, well, Gollum tried to murder them and was also terrible and this wretched being, and then he ends up being part of the solution, right? You know, like Gandalf says, I feel that he has yet some part to play in this, right? But we don't know what it is. And then he does at the end of The Return of the King. And I would like to kind of close with I don't know if I can really call this a true eucatastrophe, but I think it's a great example of how something can change. Does anybody know what that is?
It's a trench.
Yes.
Trenches in the wall.
Trenches in the wall.
Wall.
This is the Somme.
A trench tour.
This is a trench tour in the Somme. Yeah, it's actually a memorial path that you can walk also, but this is the Somme today. As you can tell just by looking, you can see the shell holes and all that stuff. And there's still, I mean, I want to be clear, you know, in lots of parts of France and Belgium and everything, there's still tons of unexploded ordnance and things. I mean, we're going to be cleaning up that war for forever, probably. I mean, yeah, it's unbelievable how many shells and things that were used in the war. But that being said, nature is sort of creating its own eucatastrophe, right? Taking these things back and turning them back into something beautiful. Even if you consider, like, in the poem in Flanders Fields, right, talking about the poppies growing in the fields and the larks flying high, right? How can it be possible that things just keep going, that everything's going to be okay, you know, that things will get better? And yet things do. and yet things do. And so I wanted to include that as sort of an example of how even then, Tolkien, who knows, could have been in this very trench, right? And things have changed. Things have changed, and things can get better. And so, sort of in closing, I want to kind of wrap with one last quote, if you will indulge me one more time, on my Tolkien letter quotes. This one is letter 65, and again, written to Christopher Tolkien in 1944, May 4th. So remember, Christopher is down there in South Africa, and the war seems to, 1944, so the war's not over yet, right? So he's trying to give heart to his son. But all big things planned in a big way feel like that to the toad under the harrow, though on a general view they do function and do their job, an ultimately evil job. For we are attempting to conquer Sauron with the ring, and we shall, it seems, succeed. But the penalty is, as you well know, to breed new Saurons and slowly turn men and elves into orcs. Not that in real life things are as clear-cut as in a story, and we started out with a great many orcs on our side. Well, there you are, a hobbit amongst the Uruk-hai. Keep up your hobbitry in heart and think that all stories feel like that when you are in them. You are inside a very great story. Thank you all very much. So, does anybody have questions?
I wonder how much Peter Jackson has influenced, because he was asked to do the World War One.
The They Shall Not Grow Old.
They Shall Not Grow Old. I wonder how much Tolkien was in his mind when he actually was doing that.
I kind of wonder that myself.
Rhetorically, I'm asking you that, but
Yeah, well, and I mean, if you've not seen They Shall Not Grow Old yet, first of all, it's a fantastic documentary about the British in World War I. But Peter Jackson's grandfather, his great grandfather was an Anzac. His grandfather was an Anzac, so he was in the Australian and New Zealand unit that served. I have no idea if his grandfather was in Gallipoli or what, but regardless, so he has family that had served